Everyone, welcome to the Brain Soup Podcast. So, as you know, Halloween is coming up, and I wanted to talk about a decade. Now, I know what you're thinking. What decade can be scarier? Well, the 90s, of course. But wait, we're not talking about the 90s this time. Yes, I spent a lot of my time talking about the 90s, but there is a small part of me who just loves the 60s. It's something about the 60s what gets me going. However, you may be thinking to yourself, come on now, how is the 60s scary? Well, we're gonna find out when we talk about one of the spookiest things from the 60s, spooky 60s pop culture. That's right, you just heard the Sonics there. But we're going to talk about some spooky pop culture, not just from music, but from everything. You said don't believe the 60s were scary? Well, stick around, you may be interested. First of all, we need to talk about why the 60s were scary for the first place. It's hard to pinpoint down why, but I think I have the answer. Keep in mind, the baby boom in the 1940s, 1950s happened, and by the time when the 1960s rolled around, you were still getting the kind of atomic age craze, you know what I mean, left over from the 50s. We were afraid, you see, us Americans, of what was going to happen, of big atomic bombs and all that stuff. We were obviously afraid. Until something happened now. Well, before I even get to that, it was a dark time for America as well. Keep in mind, this is when JFK was assassinated. Now, these are not good things, don't get me wrong. But we're going to get to the good stuff. But it's important to look why it was scary for a second. Because when a lot of people, especially people who wasn't in that era, and I wasn't, and it took me a while to figure this out, a lot of people think of the 60s as that kind of, you know, I love the flower girl, you know, that type of stuff. But when you look deeper, especially in the early 60s, you get a lot of, like, weirdness. It doesn't matter if it's from music, television, TV, I always said television, you know, theater shows, drive-in theater shows. You get a lot of that stuff. Now, a lot of people separate that stuff from the 50s. But here's the thing, that stuff went on. You know, a lot of people forget the hippie era came with the 60s. If anything, that came more into the late 60s, early 70s. So how can I put this? There's a lot to go on here. This is also the beat. This is kind of like the tail end of the beat generation. What I think had a lot to do with goth culture, what happened in the late 70s, early 80s. Now, do they have a lot in common with goths? Yes and no. But the fact, you know, it was kind of a interesting hot pause of like Because if you look back at that early culture, that beat culture, it was spooky. I mean, and everyone dressed in black, reading poetry, it was kind of spooky. And keep in mind, too, a lot of the things what were happening, in the Cold War, with the atomic age and all that stuff, and the space age, too, was like in the middle of this. But bam, everything was going down, right? Now, of course, in 1964, the Beatles came along on the Ed Sullivan Show. And a lot of people don't get this, but when the Beatles came along, it influenced a lot of young people, mostly white urban kids, to kind of pick up a guitar and basically you would get a lot of spookiness. A lot of people forget that about that time. A lot of those garage bands, what I just showed you, were spooky. Because they weren't living a rough and tumble life. The Beatles did too, coming out of England, but with these kind of American blues influence and kind of spooky things, also with the rock and roll influence, you get this kind of weird sound, I guess. It's hard to pinpoint. Okay, so, with all that happening, also keep in mind the movies were getting scarier. I mean, yeah, they were so cheesy for a moment, but then you started getting things like Rosemary's Baby, Psycho came out in the mid-60s. You got a lot of crazy stuff happening. Even if you read some of the Marvel superhero comics at the time, side note, even though, yes, a lot of them are, good guys and stuff, they came from horror roots. Spider-Man, was drawn by Steve Ditko, and a guy who was known to draw horror comics back in the 50s before the Comics Code. Wink, wink, we may talk about that at some different time, because the Comics Code is a crazy story of censorship that I want to talk about. So yeah, it's weird. Because, like I said, when people think of the 60s, you think about bubblegum pop bands. But that's not all what was going on back then, You had these surf groups, what had sort of a spooky sound. On TV, you had the Twilight Zone. It makes sense if you put all these kind of rabble things together, too. So, I don't know. It's interesting. What do you guys think? Do you think the 60s were scary, or do you think I'm off my rocker a little bit? Which I am, but that's a whole different story. Hey, I am crazy. But, let's be honest here, though, for a second. I think the 60s had the most creepiest things ever. If you look at, the Rat Fink cars even, they were kind of spooky looking. If you look at the... It was spooky. But yeah, that's kind of like what I'm talking about today, is just, I wanted to put the highlight on the more spooky 60s. Because I feel like the spooky 60s, not a lot of people are talking about, and it's interesting to me, So, before I go, I just want to say for a second, If anyone's curious, I am working on that Slacker movie. Hopefully it'll be done soon. Hopefully it won't be as long where YouTube can upload it, but it won't be too short where you guys can enjoy it some. So we'll see how that goes. It'll probably be after Halloween, because I think I'm just gonna finish all this Halloween talking about Halloween, because I love that holiday. So have a good day, bye, and next week I'll be talking about music controversies. That's right, people. And what I mean by music controversies is when, people thought jazz was of the devil, they thought rock and roll for the devil, even ragtime. I find that interesting, so I want to talk about it. So be there on the Brain Soup Podcast. Okay.